All right. My volume should be good for this live stream. Tonight we're covering Justin Griffin of LDS abuse, his analysis of Judge Roger Griffin's decision to dismiss the charges against David Lee Hamblin for raping Emily Sheets. He dismissed those charges with prejudice back in February 2025. He was responding to a motion made by then Special Prosecutor Nathan Evershed, requesting a dismissal without prejudice, in which Evershed acknowledged that the prior prosecutor, former Juab County prosecutor Ryan Peters, who had been deputized as a special prosecutor on the case back in September of 2022 or so, after Hamblin's arrest and after the Utah County Attorney's Office was disqualified for obvious reasons because Hamblin's alleged accomplice, Utah County Attorney David Levitt, was still in office. While he lost his re-election to Jeff Gray, he still held office at that time as the Utah County Attorney. And so clearly there was a conflict of interest there. And so what I want to do is address point by point the issues raised by Justin in his post on X, which I'm going to put his Twitter address in the chat so anybody joining in on this can see exactly what I'm referencing. And I also want to call attention to the probable cause statement that was filed by the recently deceased Jason Randall, along with Ryan Peters, who was the special assistant to the Utah Attorney General. In this case, he was a special prosecutor because of the aforementioned conflict with David Levitt, the then Utah County Attorney General, or the Utah County Attorney, who allegedly was Hamblin's fellow member in the LDS Church of Satan. So first things first, I want to look at this probable cause statement, the information that was filed. In it, there are 6 counts: sodomy of a child, rape of a child, sodomy of a child, aggravated sexual abuse of a child, 2 counts of aggravated sexual abuse, I believe 3 counts of sodomy of a child. In that information, there is no mention of ritual abuse. There's no mention of anything other than what Hamblin allegedly did. So I'm going to read verbatim from that criminal information. Count 1, sodomy of a child, a first-degree felony, in violation of 76-5-403.1, in that David Lee Hamblin, from January 1st, 1986 to December 31st, 1988, did engage in a sexual act upon or with an individual younger than 14 years old, involving the genitals and anus of the actor or the individual and the mouth or anus of either the actor or individual. So the allegation here, based on the probable cause statement, is that David Lee Hamblin took his neighbor, that would be Emily Sheets, and he taught her, she was between 6 and 7 years old at the time, he taught her how to perform oral sex on him and gave her techniques in order to do a good job. There were 2 other child victims that were forced to participate, and those would be Hamblin's daughters, Rachel and Eliza. Now, it's important to note that in 2003, the court in Hamblin's divorce case found that Hamblin, over a long period of time, had sexually abused both Rachel and Eliza. They both testified as to this abuse, as did 2 adult patients of Hamblin's. He used to be a clinical psychologist. He lost his job because, by his own admission, he was having sex with his patients and trying to convince them that it was therapeutic. So the Division of Occupational and Professional Licensing in Utah, after Hamblin's admission, stripped him of his license to practice as a clinical psychologist. The court in Hamblin's case, in Hamblin's divorce, during a custody hearing in which he was seeking visitation with his youngest daughter, Mimi Hamblin, found by clear and convincing evidence that he had, in fact, sexually abused Rachel and Eliza Hamblin. So that's been found, that's been established in a court of law. Admittedly, it's a lower burden of proof than beyond a reasonable doubt, but it was established in that court hearing, and the court's findings were the basis for the denial of Hamblin's attempts to have unsupervised visitation and access to his youngest daughter, Miriam. In that same hearing, that same custody trial, the court found by clear and convincing evidence that Hamblin had administered peyote, a Schedule I controlled substance under both Utah state and federal law, to his daughters, that they had become sick and violently ill as a result of his forced administration of peyote. Again, this controlled substance, and these were minors at the time. His youngest daughter, Miriam, would have been between 4 and 5 years of age at the time that he allegedly administered peyote. And we can stop saying allegedly, because it's the finding of the court that he did, in fact, abuse his daughters by forcing them to ingest a Schedule I controlled substance, peyote. Now, peyote is central to Hamblin's religious practices in Oklavoya Native American Church, which he served as a spokesman of, and the second-in-command to James Warren Flaming Eagle Mooney, the founder of Oklavoya. Mooney professed to be a Seminole Indian, a genealogist retained by prosecutors in Mooney's peyote possession case found that there was no evidence that Mooney was descended from Seminole Indians, or that he was, in fact, of Indian descent in any way, shape, fashion, or form. So there's that. Mooney was busted on 2 separate occasions. The sheriff's office raided his home in Benjamin, found 12,000 buttons of peyote in one raid and 8,000 buttons of another. Now, Mooney's healing circles, or his Indian religious ceremonies, had at most about a dozen to 18 participants at once. So it's very clear that James Warren Mooney and David Lee Hamblin and the members of Oklavoya were not simply engaged in the exercise of their religious freedoms and prerogatives. They were intending to start a drug distribution operation. Mooney eventually had to settle with the federal authorities and enter into a plea agreement in which he agreed that he would not procure and distribute peyote. So, we have an adult male, a parent, a father, who a court found had administered peyote, a controlled substance, to his daughters. The court found that he had sexually abused 2 of his daughters. The 3rd and 4th daughters did not testify. That would be Katie and Miriam Hamblin. The court did not find it necessary to have them testify. However, the court did align with the findings of psychologists who were treating Rachel and Eliza, and for the purposes of establishing whether or not Hamblin would have visitation or custody of his youngest daughter, Miriam. That's the only daughter he was seeking custody of. Katie was a minor at the time. But since Hamblin and her had fallen out, there was no need to establish whether or not he would have visitation of her. Now, in addition, DCFS and CPS issued substantiated findings of emotional abuse and then sexual abuse where Eliza Hamblin was concerned. In those reports that DCFS had from 1999 to the early 2000s, which I have in my possession from a confidential source, the girls alleged that their father was engaged in forcing them to use peyote, that he had founded his own Indian religious tribe, and that he and his neighbor Joseph Wood Binion, were co-chieftains, that they had power objects and altars all over Hamblin's backyard. According to Patty Hollenbeck Dial, a psychologist who was treating the Hamblin sisters during the late 90s, she spoke with DCFS during one of DCFS's home visits and interviews of the girls, and she said if you knew what he was telling his clients, his patients, as a psychologist, it would blow your mind. That's a quote from Patty Hollenbeck Dial. So this was not a secret. It was well known what David Lee Hamblin was up to and what he was doing. In the Provo police reports, it references satanic oaths that Hamblin was employing during his therapy sessions, forced therapy sessions with his daughters. The court also found in 2003 that Hamblin held his daughter Rachel back from school and forced her to participate in therapy sessions with Angela Fenton, a dissociative identity patient who went on to be the bookkeeper for Oklahoua Native American Church and who was in her 30s. Hamblin moved her into his home. Now, according to the Hamblin victim statements in the 2012 to 2014 case, Fenton was moved into the home as a 30-year-old woman, a dissociative identity case, and in the form of her alter ego, CJ, a young boy, she participated in the sexual abuse of the Hamblin sisters. And David Lee Hamblin had a number of people, including Conrad Gottfredson, who is a temple sealer, a temple worker at the Saratoga Springs Temple at the present moment, participate in his sessions with CJ. And Rachel Lee Hamblin was held home from school in violation of the laws of the state of Utah to participate in those sessions. Now, Emily Sheets, the woman whose allegations were dismissed with prejudice recently in 2025 against David Lee Hamblin, her allegations were dismissed with prejudice. Emily Sheets lived right across the street from the Hamblin residence in Provo. And so I want to be clear here. The fact that she was a next-door neighbor, that's not in dispute. The fact that she was friends with both Rachel and Eliza in her childhood, not in dispute. In this criminal information with the probable cause statement, Jason Randall goes on to say, between 1987 and 1988, the female victim, 7 to 8 years old, was again in the defendant's home when he forced her headfirst into a sleeping bag. While she was inside the bag, the defendant pulled her shorts down and inserted his fingers into her vagina. He then attempted to insert his penis into her vagina. Because he could only slightly penetrate her, he became frustrated. He then flipped her onto her stomach while her head and upper body were still inside the sleeping bag and inserted his fingers into her anus. He then inserted his penis into the victim's anus. Between 1992 and 1993, when the victim was 12 or 13 years old in Sanpete County, the victim was with the defendant and his family at their home. At some point, she was taken into a room where there was an adult female, that would be Roselle Stevenson, Hamblin's ex-wife, who was wearing a sheer nightgown. The defendant directed the victim to perform oral sex on the adult female, and he instructed the victim how to perform that oral sex. So that's the gist of the probable cause statement. This led to no fewer than 6 counts, including sodomy on a child, 3 counts of sodomy on a child, because he had contact with the anus or mouth of the victim. She was younger than 14 years old at the time of the offenses. And because he used force and with the intent to cause substantial emotional or bodily pain to any person, or with the intent to arouse or gratify the sexual desire of any person, in conjunction with this act, the actor committed the offense by use of a dangerous weapon, by force, violence, duress, intimidation, coercion, menace, or threat of harm. So there are 2 counts of aggravated sexual abuse of a child because David Lee Hamblin did in fact use force and coercion. He did use the threat of violence against Emily Sheets between the ages of 6 and 6 and 8 years of age. Of course, going forward into January 1992 to December 31st, 1994, when he forced Emily Sheets to perform oral sex on Roselle Hamblin, now Roselle Stevenson. Originally, her maiden name was Anderson. She is the daughter of Richard Lloyd and Karma DeYoung Anderson. She's the granddaughter, Roselle Stevenson is, of Garrett DeYoung, another alleged member of the LDS Church of Satan, and the first dean of fine arts, or the fine arts department at BYU. Richard Lloyd Anderson was a professor at BYU. For a time, when he moved back to Utah from New York after obtaining his doctorate, David Lee Hamblin worked at BYU on staff as a psychologist. So, there's 6 counts here. In no way do any of these counts reference anything ritualistic or in the way of like a satanic ritual abuse. They just simply don't, and that's deliberate on the part of the prosecutors. They picked several instances in which David Lee Hamblin did not employ satanic oaths or satanic ritual techniques. He simply sexually abused Emily Sheets with his 2 daughters, Rachel and Eliza, in the basement of their Provo residence, of the Provo Hamblin residence, in order to coerce all 3 girls into performing oral sex on him. And then, of course, he raped Emily Sheets later by forcing her into a sleeping bag. Now, what Justin Griffin brings forth is that, number one in his synopsis of what he sees from the documents, the state was actually trying to argue that SRA, satanic ritual abuse, was not part of this latest case. It wasn't. In the 3 instances cited by the prosecution, the 3 instances cited by Jason Randall, who is recently deceased, the state didn't reference any sexual or any satanic ritual abuse because there was no satanic ritual abuse. And I think the reason for that is obvious. In those 3 instances, David Lee Hamblin wasn't referencing Satan. He was just raping and abusing a child. And this is common among satanic ritual abuse perpetrators. If they'll rape somebody in a ritual context, they'll rape somebody outside of a ritual context. That's because they are sexual predators and opportunists, and sometimes they abuse in a ritual context, and sometimes they abuse outside of a ritual context. Now, there were other instances that Hamblin was not charged for, in which SRA was at issue with Emily Sheets. And so what I want to have each of the viewers understand here is, like, I want you to understand there's abuse that occurs within a satanic ritual context, and then there's abuse that occurs outside of a satanic ritual context. And ultimately, the state has its choice of which instance to charge a defendant with abuse. And in this case, for obvious reasons, they chose to charge Hamblin for abuse that he committed outside of a satanic ritual context. And so they came up with 6 counts related to 3 instances where Hamblin had abused Emily Sheets. Now, the defense, Michael Petro and Lee Ashton, argued that SRA was part of the case, and they wanted to have all of the evidence, not just for this case, the instant case that was filed in 2022 and continued until 2025, when it was dismissed with prejudice by Judge Roger Griffin, they wanted all of the evidence for any interview, any allegation of abuse that Emily Sheets had made against David Lee Hamblin and others, even though it wasn't germane or material to the instant case. It wasn't germane or material to the 6 counts over the 3 instances that the state chose to charge Hamblin with. All 3 of those instances did not involve satanic ritual abuse at all. So it wasn't material. Now, the state withheld Brady evidence for over 2 years, which contains an account of Emily Sheets in which she alleges that satanic ritual abuse took place in a church building. In its dismissal, the court ruled that this undermined a major part of the state's theory of the case, that the document should have been produced and that the case must be dismissed with prejudice. Now, here's the thing. David Lee Hamblin wasn't charged for any abuse that occurred in a church. And so the allegations in that instance are that shortly after her baptism, Emily Sheets was taken to a church building, a meeting house, and she was forced to perform oral sex on the adults who were present, and she was forced to ingest semen that was force-fed to her in a spoon. This is consistent with what Rachel, Eliza, and Catherine Hamblin allege in their victim statements from the 2012 to 2014 case. But the state didn't bring any charges against Hamblin or anyone else. So it's hard to see how that could be exculpatory for David Lee Hamblin, because it doesn't impeach Emily Sheets' allegations in the other 3 instances that he was charged for. It's not exculpatory. It doesn't prove that he's innocent of those 3 charges, or of those 3 instances, or the 6 counts of abuse that were brought against him. In fact, it doesn't have anything to do with those 3 instances or those 6 criminal counts. So it's not a Brady violation to withhold that evidence because it's immaterial to those 6 counts. Now, this obviously was not what Judge Roger Griffin found, but that's the argument that I would make in response to the third point that Justin brings up. The state's theory of the case is that David Lee Hamblin, on 3 separate occasions, sexually abused Emily Sheets. First off, when she was between 6 and 7 years old, he had her over to his house to play with his daughters. He bought Rachel and Eliza Hamblin, his daughters, and Emily Sheets down to his basement, where he had a home office that he practiced out of as a clinical psychologist. He then instructed the girls on how to perform oral sex on him. That is sodomy on a child, because all 3 of those girls were under 14 years of age at the time. And under Utah law, that's the cutoff point between sodomy on someone who's above 14 and someone who's below 14. If you're a child in Utah, you're under 14. So, based on the facts alleged in the probable cause statement, there's nothing ritualistic about that. There's nothing involving Satan or satanic ritual abuse in that instance. As a result, the defense's argument that satanic ritual abuse was a part of that instance of abuse is bullshit, quite frankly. And the defense wanted not only all of the evidence for the immediate case involving Emily Sheets, they wanted the evidence brought in from the 2012 to 2014 Hamblin case because they wanted to muddy the waters. And they wanted this case to be about satanic ritual abuse. What they did not want this case to be about was good old-fashioned child sexual abuse. And so the state withheld that evidence as immaterial for over 2 years. It contained an account which David Lee Hamblin was not charged for by Emily Sheets of satanic ritual abuse taking place in a church building shortly after her baptism, when she was forced to ingest semen from a spoon from the assembled men who were part of an alleged multi-generational cult. And so this was cited by Judge Roger Griffin as Brady evidence, even though it doesn't exculpate David Lee Hamblin in the slightest. If anything, it's just another allegation of criminal behavior on his part, and it's not relevant to the 3 instances that he was charged with 6 criminal counts for in the Emily Sheets case in 2022. So the court agreed with the defense that the evidence in the police report that was withheld was exculpatory, and therefore Hamblin's constitutional rights were violated. The court ruled that the case should be dismissed with prejudice based on several reasons, including the length of the delay, the fact that the prosecutor, the second special prosecutor, Nathan Evershed, stated that he felt the evidence issues were insurmountable in terms of getting a conviction. And here's the thing, the only reason that evidence was admitted in Emily Sheets' case was because Judge Roger Griffin somehow found that it was relevant to 6 counts, criminal counts against David Lee Hamblin, which were completely unrelated to that instance in a meeting house. 2 of the instances of sexual assault against Emily Sheets by David Lee Hamblin took place in Hamblin's home in Provo. A third took place in his residence, his second home in San Pete County in Spring City. So it wasn't relevant. It wasn't material to the case. It wasn't material to those 6 counts or those 3 instances of abuse. But Judge Roger Griffin, for obvious reasons, let it in, allowed it to be admissible. He also went beyond the immediate allegations against David Lee Hamblin in the Sheets case, and he went all the way back to the early 2000s, which was when the first police reports were filed against Hamblin by Hamblin's daughters. Now, if the defense wanted to use that to impeach the testimony of Rachel and Eliza Hamblin, that's fine. But the reality of it is there's a court in Hamblin's divorce case who found that Hamblin, by clear and convincing evidence, sexually abused his daughters. And by Hamblin's own admission, he was having sex with his patients and attempting to convince them that it was therapeutic. And here's the other thing. There is another victim, an adult male victim by the name of Brett Bluth, who alleged that Hamblin forced him to participate in oral sex. The story that Hamblin told Bluth, a returning missionary, was that in order to cure his homosexuality, the semen of the unrighteous men who Hamblin contended had sexually abused Bluth and therefore caused his homosexual impulses, that semen had to be driven out, and it could only be driven out by the semen of a righteous man. And you guessed it. Who's the righteous man? David Lee Hamblin, Brett Bluth's therapist. And so David Lee Hamblin coerced Brett Bluth into participating in fellatio with him. So in order to be cured of your homosexuality, you have to engage in homosexual acts with your therapist. But someone who grows up Mormon, who just wants to stop being gay and who is desperate to cure themselves of their homosexual attractions will fall for just about anything, especially when it comes from someone who was an elders quorum president, a priesthood holder, and who was recommended to Brett Bluth by his bishop, Conrad Gottfredson, who allegedly told Bluth and others that Hamblin had helped him overcome his same-sex attraction. And so Conrad Gottfredson was a bishop, he was a stake president, and he is currently a temple worker at the Saratoga Springs Temple. That's the level. Gottfredson was also the referral who brought Hamblin Angie Fenton, the dissociative identity patient who Hamblin moved into his home in Provo and who allegedly sexually abused Hamblin's daughters during therapy sessions. While she was dissociated, allegedly, and dissociated in the form of a young boy named CJ. So, let's talk about Nathan Evershed, the second prosecutor in this case. In late October or in late 2023, in late 2024, 2022 actually, Governor Spencer Cox, for a reason we can all guess, appointed then special prosecutor and Juab County Attorney Ryan Peters, who was the sole special assistant on this case to the Utah Attorney General, the only deputized member of the prosecution at that time. He appointed him to a juvenile court judgeship. And for the better part of 8 months, the Hamblin case did not have a prosecutor as a result. And the defense filed a motion to dismiss, but due to public outcry, which yours truly had a hand in fomenting, the Utah Attorney General's office was inundated with calls from concerned citizens, and a second special prosecutor, Nathan Evershed, was appointed. Now, here's the problem with that. Nathan Evershed's brother is a convicted sex offender with a proclivity for teenage girls. He violated his probation while he lived in California. And Nathan Evershed took campaign contributions in his campaign against Salt Lake County Attorney, or Salt Lake City Attorney, or DA, Sim Gill. So Evershed ran a political campaign against Sim Gill. He took donations for that campaign from his convicted sex offender brother. As it turns out, Evershed's parents had dealings in Alpine, real estate dealings, with a member of the extended Hamblin family. That would be Geraldine Hamblin, Geraldine Hamblin's son, Corey Bangerter, I believe his name is. And Alpine just so happens to be mentioned as a hotbed of the Church of Satan in the Hamblin victim statements. So there's multiple issues with Evershed being appointed, not the least of which are those issues. Both Evershed and Peters slow-walked this case. I want to be very clear about that. In my experience, it does not take from September of 2022, actually, in the Sheets case, to February of 2025 to have so much as a preliminary hearing. Emily Sheets never got to testify. She never got her day in court for a preliminary hearing, which is basically establishing that there's probable cause to go forward. That hearing never happened in almost 3 years of waiting. That's the level in Utah. And I'm not saying that it's anything special, because in Utah, the conviction rate for rape is 2.97%. The prosecution rate, that is, the cases that are actually brought to trial or brought to court, not even trial, just filed in court, is under 12%. So in Utah, even though it ranks in the top 10 consistently for rape, it's the only category of violent crime that Utah exceeds the national average in, and that is even though between 20 and 30% of victims report their rapes. That means that 7 or 8 out of 10 don't report. And the reason is because they know they're going to get treated like Emily Sheets. And other matters are going to be dredged up that have nothing to do with the criminal charges against their abuser. And Utah judges are going to find any way that they can, and Utah prosecutors are going to find any way that they can to make those cases go away, especially when it's a defendant like David Lee Hamblin, who is allegedly connected to some of the more prominent political and business figures in the state of Utah. Because if you actually read the Hamblin victim statements and you read the police reports, one of the things that jumps out at you is there are 5 pages worth of names I've indexed over on investigationsinritualabuse.com. I went through all 8 victim statements, and I gave anyone who would care to read an index of names that appear in the Hamblin victim statements. along with the page numbers where they appear. And over the course of that, those victim statements, one of the things that's alleged is that the LDS Church of Satan has gatekeepers in prominent positions politically, legally, medically, and those gatekeepers who are members of this group, who are engaged in criminal acts against victims like Emily Sheets, can interdict any attempt to report on the members of the LDS Church of Satan and can make those allegations go away. Some of the more disturbing allegations are that these gatekeepers who are psychologists and psychiatrists can have victims committed involuntarily, and in doing so they can discredit them as mentally ill. And that was a threat that was utilized against Rachel, Eliza, Catherine, and Miriam Hamblin repeatedly throughout those victim statements. If it's true, it's an absolute bombshell, because it would mean that this group is entrenched in any number of establishments. The medical establishment, the legal establishment, they have judges, they have lawyers, they have doctors, they have psychiatrists, they have prominent business people. And one of the people that's named is David Okerlund Levitt, the younger brother of former Utah Governor Mike Levitt. And some of the allegations against David Levitt beyond the Hamblin case are absolutely stunning. For instance, his prosecution of polygamous Tom Green. In an interview, one of Tom Green's ex-wives said that Levitt came to their house and sat down and told them not to worry about the impending prosecution of Tom Green for bigamy or for welfare fraud, because it was a test case to get polygamy legalized. And it turns out that was another Levitt lie, because Tom Green went to prison, albeit he went to prison for a very short period of time for what he did, which was to take a 12, 13-year-old girl over international lines into Mexico so that he could be sealed to her in a marriage ceremony. And she later gave birth at 13 years of age, I believe, to Green's child. And this is something that Green rinsed and repeated time and time again over the course of his life. His M.O. was to marry a woman with daughters and to begin molesting those daughters when they were on the cusp of adolescence, 11, 12 years of age. Now, I have talked to multiple people, including victims, who said that Green's abuse of them began when they were around 12 or 13 years of age, and he later would marry them. He would take them to places like Idaho, where you can get married to a 14-year-old. He'd take them to places like Mexico, and he would get married to them after divorcing his prior wife. Now, the marriage continued. Obviously, those women stayed with Tom Green. And David Levitt gained infamy because, as Juab County attorney, he prosecuted Tom Green, turns around, and then becomes the defense attorney for Tom Green's son when that son is busted for having sex or for child rape, basically, because he has sex with a girl who's, I believe, 13. And David Levitt magically emerges to be the defense attorney of Tom Green's eldest son, who recruited this girl off of the internet. I believe it was MySpace. And so, with David Lee Hamblin, that's not his only prominent connection. It's not just David Levitt. There's a man named Sterling Van Wagenen who was convicted in 2 separate jurisdictions for sexually abusing a girl. Before Sterling Van Wagenen was convicted of sexually abusing a girl, he co-founded Sundance Film Festival with Robert Redford, who was married to Van Wagenen's cousin, Lola Van Wagenen. And this is significant because Sundance Film Festival employed LDS Church of Satan member and so-called High Council Punisher Gordon Bowen, the advertising executive who co-founded McGarry Bowen, now Dentsu McGarry Bowen, and who lives in Holiday, Utah, who appears in the Hamblin victim statements in one of the more gruesome descriptions of sexual abuse and ritual abuse, and whose divorce records are replete with his journal entries in which he describes his sins as being foreordained so that he could learn the secret codes and combinations in order to complete some sort of unspecified mission in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And so Gordon Bowen went on to work at Sundance and eventually be fired by Robert Redford, allegedly because he was utilizing his work computers to watch pornography as opposed to doing his job. And that wasn't the first time Gordon Bowen was nailed on that. But back to Sterling Van Wagenen. Sterling Van Wagenen is the man who produced the old Temple films for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He's a prominent filmmaker in the LDS. And, of course, the LDS Church likes to hold up their members who have achieved some notoriety in the arts and culture and business. And it also runs interference for those members as much as it can. So in a police interview involving a male victim who later went on Mormon Stories with John DeLim, Van Wagenen admitted that he sexually abused that boy. He admitted that he'd abused that male victim. And then he identified David Lee Hamblin as his therapist and said that Hamblin was helping him work through those issues. And no wonder that Van Wagenen later got busted for abusing a female victim, because guess what? David Lee Hamblin himself was a sexual predator. So you have a sexual predator leading a sexual predator in a therapeutic sense. And, of course, Sterling Van Wagenen is now in a Utah State prison because he was convicted of sexually abusing that girl in 2 separate jurisdictions. He was never charged, even though he admitted the crime that he committed against his male victim. So there's another link to a prominent Utahn who the church, for obvious reasons, held up as an example of, a high-achieving Mormon. He just happened to be diddling kids in the process and molesting them. So there's that. There's Gordon Bowen, who is a multimillionaire advertising executive, who used to work at Bonneville Productions for the church. He oversaw advertising campaigns for the church and other private clients. But primarily, Bowen worked for the church on church advertising campaigns. And while he was at Bonneville Communications, he was friends with and work associates with a man named Lincoln Kevin Kelly, who followed Bowen to New York after Bonneville Communications fired Bowen, purportedly for misusing his expense account. This is a theme that occurs over and over and over again in Bowen's career, that is being fired for impropriety. So Lincoln Kevin Kelly and others followed Bowen to New York when Bowen's found a soft landing at an advertising agency called Ogilvy Mather. And this is apparently where Bowen met David Lee Hamblin, because while Bowen was in New York, he was a therapy patient of David Lee Hamblin, who was completing his clinical work to complete his doctorate, which he received from the University of Arizona. Hamblin was living in Port Chester, New York at 77 Terrain Avenue in an apartment that was allegedly chock full of Church of Satan members, including a landlord who allegedly abused the Hamblin sisters in the basement while their father was present and consenting to the abuse. So the issue here is that the connections keep piling up. No matter where you look, no matter who it is, there's always a connection that is corroborative of what the Hamblin sisters alleged in their victim statements. And so, time and time again, as it pertains to this, there's far more that's corroborative, and there's nothing that isn't corroborative. That is, I've been looking into this since August of 2022, and I have not found a single contradiction in those victim statements. I haven't found a single lie. I haven't found anything that would discredit Emily Sheets. And one of the issues here is this argument that Judge Roger Griffin and Nathan Evershed make, and the defense makes, that satanic ritual abuse is a part of these 6 counts in the Emily Sheets prosecution that was filed. The information was filed in September 2022. Ritual abuse doesn't occur in those 6 counts. It doesn't occur in those 3 instances that form the basis or the factual basis for those 6 criminal counts. Quite simply, there's nothing to do with ritual abuse in those 6 counts or those 3 instances that form the factual basis for those 6 counts. There's no reference to Satan. There's no ritual chanting of mumbo jumbo or anything else. While my contention over the past 3.5 years has been that all sexual abuse is satanic, for obvious reasons, in this case, based on the probable cause and the facts entered by Jason Randall as part of that criminal information, satanic ritual abuse did not apply in these 3 instances. This is just David Lee Hamblin sexually abusing at least 3 children on 3 separate instances. And so Emily Sheets had a really good case in the sense that there's no muddying the waters. David Lee Hamblin didn't invoke Satan down in that basement in Provo when he forced Emily Sheets and Rachel and Eliza Hamblin to perform oral sex on him. He didn't invoke Satan when he forced Emily Sheets into a sleeping bag and anally sodomized her. He didn't invoke Satan or chant anything or do anything ritualistic when he forced Emily Sheets to perform oral sex on his wife, Roselle, in Spring City. It had nothing to do with Satan. David Lee Hamblin is a sexual predator. Sometimes he abuses in a satanic ritual abuse context, and other times he doesn't. Because he's a sexual predator, he's an opportunist, and the state has let him off the hook multiple times. So it isn't just sexual abuse that I'm talking about, which, by the way, DCFS and CPS, as I mentioned earlier, issued substantiated findings. They substantiated allegations of emotional abuse and sexual abuse by Eliza Hamblin before 2000. Like, the police reports, they reference satanic oaths. The DCFS reports reference Hamblin's affiliation and like his establishment of his own Indian religion. He served as a co-chieftain with his neighbor Joe Binion, and he forced his daughters to ingest peyote. He wasn't charged with any crime for forcing a 4-year-old, that would be his daughter Miriam, to ingest a controlled substance. He wasn't charged for his role in what arguably was a drug distribution operation operating under the guise of an Indian church. That would be Oklawaha Native American Church, whose founder, James Warren Mooney, was caught with 20,000 buttons of peyote. And the reason for all of this, and the reason David Lee Hamblin has been shielded time and time again, is because David Lee Hamblin was involved with some very powerful and prominent Utahns. And in this state, image is everything. You remember those old Canon commercials with Andre Agassi, the tennis player? That slogan, image is everything, is applicable to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and the Utah political establishment, which would rather sweep the truth under the rug by calling every allegation of sexual abuse against David Lee Hamblin satanic ritual abuse, rather than just acknowledging sometimes he abuses in a satanic ritual abuse context, and sometimes he just opportunistically abuses outside of that context. The thing of it is, if you'll rape a child, sometimes you're a satanic ritual abuser. You'll rape them in either context. Because at the end of the day, you're just a sexual predator. And one of the things that needs to happen when it comes to satanic ritual abuse is that we need to demystify it. And we don't need to focus on the ritualistic aspects or the satanic aspects. What we need to focus on is the fact that these people are committing crimes. They are sexually assaulting other individuals. That's the only relevant matter. I don't care if it occurs in a ritual context or not. It is a crime to rape children. It is a crime to rape adults. It is a crime to use force, duress, or coercion, or threats of violence, or actual violence to coerce someone into a sexual act, especially when that person in the state of Utah is under 14 years of age, and it's just very clear that that qualifies as aggravated sexual assault. So I don't particularly want to hear any of this bullshit that Judge Roger Griffin and Nathan Evershed were purveying or trying to ply with the public, that this is satanic panic. Well, David Lee Hamblin wasn't charged with anything related to that alleged instance at an LDS meeting house, so it wasn't material or germane to the case or to the crimes that he was charged with, all of which occurred outside of a satanic ritual abuse context. It was just garden variety sexual abuse, if there is such a thing. And it's hard to see how an additional allegation that Hamblin and others were part of a satanic religious ceremony taking place in an LDS meeting house in which a young child after her 8th birthday and after her baptism into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was forced to ingest semen from a spoon. I don't know how that's exculpatory. I don't know how that tends to prove David Lee Hamblin's innocence. If anything, it's just another allegation against him that tends to establish that there are multiple people who accuse him of abusing people in a ritual context in addition to a non-ritual context. Because here's the thing, 2 adult victims of Hamblin who were his therapy patient testified at his divorce and his custody hearing. They testified about the abuse against them that he committed. There were multiple people who came forward in the Doppel investigation who weren't included in that investigation. When Brett Bluth asked Doppel if they wanted his statement about the abuse that he suffered against at the hands of David Lee Hamblin, Doppel told him they already had victims because Hamblin had already come forward because he'd been threatened by Brett Bluth. And Brett Bluth said, if you don't turn yourself in, I'm going to go to Doppel and I'm going to report you. So how any of this is exculpatory to David Lee Hamblin rather than tending to prove that he is, in fact, a scumbag and a piece of shit who abused adults and children with impunity over at least a 30, 40-year period. And here's the chilling thing. In American Fork, David Lee Hamblin is still holding his healing circles in a home in American Fork owned by a knife maker named Eldon Talley, who is part of Hamblin's Indian church that Hamblin formed when he broke away from Oklahoma. He called it Teteatopa, and he formed it with Eldon Talley and a man named Wayne Jones Hentz. Wayne Jones Hentz later married Hamblin's youngest sister, Kristen Creetuttle, who also appears in the Hamblin victim statements as a member of the LDS Church of Satan. And the Hamblin sisters allege that their aunt, Kristen Creetuttle, and their other aunt, Susan Suki Hamblin, or Susan Suki Christensen, the wife of Craig Christensen, who is now a Provo City Council member and a bishop of a young single adults ward in Provo, that they were engaged in incestuous sexual contact with their brother, David Lee Hamblin. And the allegations in terms of the Hamblin family are absolutely disgusting. In one of the allegations, David Lee Hamblin and his brother Stephen allegedly forced Catherine Hamblin to eat feces that David Lee Hamlin's younger brother Stephen would refer to his, quote, poo-poo platter. He would defecate and children would be forced to consume it. Like, that's the level of what these people are accused of. In addition to child rape, sodomy on a child, aggravated sexual abuse of a child, and murder. Like, that's what we're dealing with here. And so if you were to bring in the satanic ritual abuse allegations in that context to the Sheets trial, it is not exculpatory. It doesn't tend to prove David Lee Hamblin's innocence at all. Now, what Roger Griffin and Nathan Evershed and Hamblin's defense attorney, Michael Petro, and his other defense attorney, Lee Ashton, would contend is that it's so outlandish and so incredible that it can't possibly be true. One of the things that Judge Roger Griffin allowed the defense to do, and that the prosecution and the Utah County Sheriff's Office allowed the defense to do, was to have basically a free run of the narrative. And so when Michael Petro and Lee Ashton, in their court filings, said there were text logs between the Utah County Sheriff's Office employees in which they said that the Hamblin sisters stand by their statements or allegations, their witness statements from the 2012 to 2014 case, quote, more or less. The prosecution didn't ask them to specify anything else. The prosecution didn't challenge it in their replies. In fact, the prosecution didn't challenge hardly anything that Hamblin's defense attorneys put forth, because the prosecution wasn't fighting this case to win. First off, everybody wanted this case to go away for obvious reasons, because if what the Hamblin sisters were saying in the original case from 2012 to 2014 was true, David Lee Hamblin could have flipped on some very prominent people, including David Levitt, and God knows who else. Because one of the things about the people named in that, especially Gordon Bowen, is that they connect to some very powerful people in the church, including Mitt Romney, whose sons stayed at Gordon Bowen's apartment in New York City when they were interning for Reebok and other companies. And then there's Mitt Romney. He has been Gordon Bowen's friend for at least 30 years. And over the course of that time, according to Bowen's divorce documents, it wasn't like Bowen was discreet about being a homosexual man. It wasn't that he was discreet about making passes against his coworkers. Coworker after coworker, there was 40 statements and affidavits filed in Bowen's divorce case with his ex-wife, Barbara Timothy. And over the course of those divorce proceedings, one coworker after another alleged that Bowen had sexually molested them or attempted to sexually molest them on work trips, that he would insist that they share a bed with him on work trips, and they would wake up in the night to Bowen fondling their genitalia, or that Bowen would make sexual remarks to them. One of the people who filed a statement said there was a young, sickly boy that they saw at Bowen's home before a dinner party. And that boy said that he was staying with Bowen at his home. Now, he wasn't related to Bowen. The other allegation is that Bowen recruited or trafficked boys to New York and he offered financial incentives for them to stay in his apartment. Bowen's former secretary, Michelle Aventario, said as much in her statement. She said that she worried that there would be bodies of boys found by the police in Bowen's yard. Think about how awful you have to be for someone you worked with to even imply such a thing. Other statements offered by Bowen's ex-girlfriend noted that she caught him with homosexual pornography in his home in New York. She confronted him about it. Gordon Bowen is a deeply troubled man who has yet to come to terms with his homosexuality. He made thousands of calls over months to gay male escort services. He said for the purposes of massages, not for sex. Of course, most of us, when we need a massage, we go to a professional masseuse or a massage therapist as opposed to a gay male escort 900 number. He made thousands of those calls over a months-long period. The phone logs were entered into evidence in his divorce trial. The journal entries Gordon Bowen wrote about learning the secret codes and combinations and his sins being foreordained, those were also entered into evidence. The Holy Dream, Bowen's sketch about a homoerotic Jesus riding a horse and a young blonde girl standing in front of men who are doing like feverish penis pulling exercises. That's Gordon Bowen's writing. And so when you read the Hamblin victim statements, while you may be put off by the allegations against Bowen, you might say to yourself, there's just absolutely no way this is true. When you start looking at Bowen's writings from his divorce, the things that were in his journal, the things that he wrote about that are now public knowledge, suddenly you start seeing Gordon Bowen in a very different light. And when you read what his coworkers had to say about him in his inappropriate, often criminal behavior, and some of the things that he talked about doing in Chicago, that you would know about if you had done the work that I've done in terms of going to people in Bowen's past and interviewing them, you would have a whole different outlook on Bowen. You would also have a whole different outlook on people in the church that he was connected to, like Boyd K. Packer. Because when Bowen was at Bonneville Communications, he had Packer's ear. He bought Packer all kinds of gifts. He laid into him with flattery. And he used his relationship with Packer to get rid of his rivals at Bonneville and in the church media department. That would be men like Heber Badsgard. Or not Badsgard, that's the couple. Heber Woolsey is actually at Janine Badsgard. The famous LDS author is Heber Woolsey's daughter. And as it turns out, Janine was accused by at least 3 of her children of being part of a satanic ritual abuse family and cult. And the allegations made by those children line up in terms of locations and in terms of beliefs that were taught to children of these families. Almost exactly. And so what I would say to you is, time and time again, the Badsgard case and the Hamblin case aligned. They were corroborative of each other. And here is Heber Woolsey at the church media office at the time that Gordon Bowen was at Bonneville and had the ear of Boyd K. Packer, and later had the ear of Melvin Russell Ballard, who achieved some level of infamy in later life because of his affiliation with Tim Ballard. Tim Ballard, of course, is the supposed Davidic servant, according to Abraham Gileadi, who was allegedly excommunicated in the early 90s for attempting for a time to engage in plural marriage. And Gordon Bowen also is the former therapy patient or marriage therapy patient of Tom Harrison. Tom Harrison is the inspiration behind the book written by John Pontius, Visions of Glory, which, if you know what that is, you've heard all about its influence, which has been absolutely toxic in terms of its influence on Mormons, and it's a grotesque book. If you actually read the contents, it's not spiritually edifying, it's not biblical, it is satanic. And it has captured the imagination of some very unstable people, like Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell, and others. And Tim Ballard is part of a group of people who operate out of San Pete County, like Abraham Gileadi, who comes in and rents a house in San Pete County with other men annually. And they have allegedly stowed John Pontius's wife in a house in San Pete. And they tend to her every need because they believe that John Pontius didn't die. They believe that he was translated. There are so many rabbit holes with this and so many rabbit trails you could go down. But the common theme is all these people are out of their minds. And all these people have allegations of ritual abuse against them. So when I say Abraham Gileadi has abuse allegations against him, when I say that Tim Ballard has abuse allegations against him, when I say that Tom Harrison has abuse allegations against him, I am not talking about what other people have told me secondhand. I'm talking about what victims have alleged to me about these men. And in the context of the Hamblin victim statements, where it talks about these people forming networks and moving into neighborhoods where they already have a presence, it makes total sense. And the reason David Lee Hamblin was left off the hook, the reason why the Sheets case was dismissed, is because it was too close to those types of people. And make no mistake about it, M. Russell Ballard and his children were in business with Tim Ballard while M. Russell Ballard was alive. And the church knew what was going on because, according to Tim Ballard, M. Russell Ballard sanctioned the couple's ruse. M. Russell Ballard gave him his blessing to engage in the couple's ruse in order to aid and abet Tim Ballard's sex trafficking mission, which, you know, as most sex traffickers do, when you want to save the children, you go down to Central and South America and you go to nightclubs and bars with civilians on jump operations, and you do ecstasy and ketamine, and occasionally you have to take one for the team and touch a teenage girl's breast so you don't blow your cover. And let's talk about some of those men. Let's talk about how some of those men who are prominent in OUR are gay. Like Ed Smart. Ed Smart is a homosexual. That's the reality of it. I heard it from too many people. Just like Gordon Bowen's gay. Like, that's the reality of this case, this Hamblin case. It ties in with all of these other sticky wickets for the church. And the reason Tim Ballard was sacrificed via a press release that was allegedly written by Gordon Bowen for the church and released to Vice News of all outlets is because the church was seeking to save itself from exposure and seeking to save a Quorum of 12 member in the latter stages of his life from being publicly outed for his corrupt business entanglements with Tim Ballard. And I know Tim's a litigious guy. I know he's pugilistic, and he wants you to believe that he's in Syria on the ground trying to save Christians. And I know that in his inner circle, he's some sort of anointed servant of God, some possibly Davidic servant mentioned in Isaiah by Abraham Gileadi. That's not Abraham's real name. Abraham, like a lot of other saints, likes to LARP. That is live action role play. He likes to LARP as a Jew. He's not a Jew. He's Dutch. And he's from Hawaii, as I understand it. And much of his background has been scrubbed for obvious reasons. And so, what I would tell you is you could follow endless rabbit trails with this in any number of directions. One of the challenges of covering the Hamblin case is disciplining my focus to just the Hamblin case. Because time and time again, I get tips that, it's sources who would take me in an entirely different direction. They take me down the Tom Harrison rabbit trail, or the Tim Ballard rabbit trail, or the Abraham Gileadi rabbit trail, or the translation cults, like the Three Nephites. They believe that that's actually a thing, and that John Pontius was translated instead of dying. All of these outlandish cults that have arisen in Sanpete County, they're too numerous to even quantify. And it would take dozens of me to cover all of that. It would take dozens of Justins to cover all of that. But the central issue here is whether or not Judge Roger Griffin was justified in saying that the Hamblin case should be dismissed with prejudice because the state withheld exculpatory evidence. That is what is called Brady material, which they are constitutionally and legally obligated to turn over to the Hamblin defense. And what I'm saying to you is the state didn't withhold anything exculpatory for David Lee Hamblin, anything that was corroborative of his innocence in these 3 instances or these 6 counts brought against him for raping and sexually abusing Emily Sheets. Like, none of the information related to that alleged ritual that took place in a meeting house after Emily Sheets' birthday and baptism is relevant to those 6 criminal counts. It has nothing to do with it. It's not. Those 6 criminal counts have nothing to do with ritual abuse whatsoever. And time again, I want to stress this. One of the things about ritual abusers is they'll rape a child in a ritual context, that is, invoking satanic oaths and imagery and mumbo-jumbo, mystical mumbo-jumbo here and there. And they'll also rape children and adults outside of that context because they're just sexual predators and deviants. And those who muddy the water betray themselves on some level as being part of the corruption. And Judge Roger Griffin, in dismissing the Sheets case with prejudice, and Special Prosecutor Nathan Evershed, in moving to dismiss the Sheets case, he didn't talk with Emily Sheets beforehand. I know that from Emily Sheets. He gave her heads up. She was shocked. Her victim's advocate was shocked. Everyone was shocked when he moved to dismiss the cases. The reality of it is, over 2 years, 2.5 years of this, we never had so much as a preliminary hearing, which is standard in a criminal prosecution. It determines the sufficiency of the evidence in moving forward, and it gives the victim a chance to testify about what happened to them. And Emily Sheets never got so much as her day in court in a preliminary hearing, let alone a trial. And that should outrage everybody, especially in the context of the 2014 dismissal by the Utah County Attorney's Office of the original charges against David Lee Hamblin. Because David Lee Hamblin's daughters had waited since 2003 to see him prosecuted, when the court, in his divorce, found by clear and convincing evidence that he had sexually abused them. That's what you're up against here. A court in 2003 found by clear and convincing evidence, that is, the testimony of a medical professional who had treated the Hamblin sisters, and of course, the testimony of the Hamblin sisters themselves against their father. And of course, Hamblin didn't dispute administering a controlled substance to his daughters. He didn't dispute moving Angela Fenton into his home, a dissociative identity patient who was mentally unstable. He didn't dispute that. He didn't dispute having Rachel Hamblin, who was a child, stay home and help him in therapy sessions, even though she wasn't medically qualified. She knew training. She was a child, and she should have been in the school. But she wasn't. Her father was feeding her and her sisters, one of whom was 4 years of age, peyote. He wasn't charged for that, even though it's a Schedule I controlled substance, so under both state and federal law, and these were minors. He wasn't charged with abusing his daughters for that. He wasn't charged in 1999 or 2000 when DCFS and CPS issued substantiated findings of emotional abuse and sexual abuse for his abuse of his daughter, Eliza Hamblin. He wasn't charged for that. He wasn't charged criminally for abusing his patients as a clinical psychologist when he admitted to having sex with them and trying to convince them that it was part of their therapy. Doppel confined it to the instances that he admitted to. Doppel didn't investigate his entire practice or his entire patient load, because if they had, they probably would have found the other victim, whose case is still ongoing in San Pete almost 3 years after it was filed. That would be Tobias Schroeder. Almost 4 years now that Tobias Schroeder has waited to have his day in court and to see David Lee Hamblin held to an account for what he allegedly did. Forcing a sexual abuse victim to masturbate him during therapy sessions. That's the level, because Tobias Schroeder was sexually abused by a teenage boy when his parents were out to dinner, and that teenage boy was babysitting him. And when his parents came back to Spring City from out of state and realized that there was something going on with their son, they asked around for a referral. And guess what? One of Hamblin's neighbors and alleged members of the LDS Church of Satan was the one who recommended David Lee Hamblin, who then proceeded to sexually abuse Tobias Schroeder again, who was a 5-year-old boy whose parents just wanted to see him heal from the sexual abuse he'd already suffered. And here's David Lee Hamblin sexually abusing him again, just like he abused countless other patients. The reality of it is Doppel only nailed him for a few. Doppel only took his license for the sexual abuse he committed against a few of his patients. This man has gotten away with sexual abuse of his therapy patients, of children, of adults for over 40 years. He's still holding his healing circles in American Fork at Eldon Talley's home. He admitted on his YouTube channel that he had sex with his patients, and I quote, "It worked for some of them, not for others." Like, imagine that. This is a guy who just had felony charges, 6 felony counts dismissed against him, who has pending counts for sexually abusing Tobias Schroeder in therapy sessions, and he point blank goes on YouTube and says, "I had sex with my patients, and it worked for some of them, but not for others." He's got an active criminal case for that same activity. And he wants to say it worked for some of them, it didn't work for others. Well, tell that to Brett Bluth, whose entire life has been upended. Tell that to the 2 adult female patients who testified at the custody trial in Hamblin's divorce. Tell that to Hamblin's daughters. one of whom has Hamblin on a recorded line, and he apologizes to her for raping her and still doesn't get convicted in 2013 and 2014. His exact words, and this is up on investigationsandritualabuse.com. It's over at my Substack, Investigations in Ritual Abuse. The audio is there. You can hear him say, "I apologize. I am sorry for raping you." That's an exact quote. And they still didn't convict him. And you want to have this debate. And I'm not saying Justin's wrong for this. I understand how anybody reviewing those records could get that impression, because those are the court records. And if you don't have an understanding of the context in which Hamblin operated, the entire context, if you haven't spent almost 4 years of your life digging into this and following every thread and talking to, at this point, 325 people, 99 of whom I deem totally credible. That is, I didn't find anything wrong or unfactual or deceitful about their allegation. In fact, I found mounds of corroboration. And the frustrating thing about this, from my perspective, is that the victims in Utah, the victims of this man, overwhelmingly don't want to come forward. And you know what? I can't blame them, because when I saw what happened to Emily Sheets, and I see what's going on with Tobias Schroeder, and I see what happened with Rachel, Eliza, and Catherine Hamblin, when I see what's happened with Brett Bluth and others, those are the public ones that you know about. I'm telling you, there's a mountain of people you don't know about. And because it's their story to tell, and it's their evidence to bring, I did free work for them to a man after they saw what happened with Emily Sheets. They didn't want to come forward. And why would they? In a state that has a 2.97% conviction rate for rape. A state that ranks 1 or 2 in sexual abuse allegations every year. A state that ranks in the top 10 in rape allegations. That is, rape cases that are filed. Only category of violent crime that this state is above the national average in, according to the FBI. Why would any victim want to go through the 2.5 years that Emily Sheets went through, while David Lee Hamblin got to walk around as a free man? At most, he had an ankle monitor on. And Roselle Stevenson got to go to her swim class. His wife, who he instructed Emily Sheets on how to perform oral sex on, who, according to the Hamblin victim statements, which 3 of her daughters filed with the Provo Police Department, according to those victim statements, they couldn't get to school on time because their mother would have them perform oral sex on her and suck her breast. And so they'd be late for school. And the court noted this in the custody trial for David Lee Hamblin. They noted that he didn't, they laid the blame entirely on David Lee Hamblin, not on Roselle Stevenson. Not on Roselle. They blamed it all on David Lee Hamblin. How convenient that his daughters were truant, that they didn't attend school regularly, as required by law. And if you think that's bad, consider this. In his divorce, Hamblin was ordered to pay alimony and child support. He made exactly one payment. He had over $200,000 in arrears in alimony and child support in 2012, and Roselle tried to have him prosecuted for that. Any one of us, anyone watching this, any normal person, you would have been prosecuted criminally for not paying your child support, not paying your alimony. You'd been held in contempt of court. Did David Lee Hamblin face any culpability for that? No, he did not. And here's the other thing that should drive the point home to you. The physical evidence that was turned over in both criminal cases against David Lee Hamblin is unaccounted for. I know this because I filed grammar requests inquiring as to the whereabouts of some of that evidence. And the police have either been unresponsive to me, or they've been unresponsive to victims who turned over evidence. Evidence that allegedly had semen and DNA on it. They could have proven this, or at least been corroborative of the allegations against David Lee Hamblin. That's the reality of this case. So when I hear them talking about Brady violations, Mike O'Petro and Lee Ashton, I see the prosecutors letting them have a free rein with the narrative and establish this narrative that the Hamblin girls have retracted their statements. And I see that they're citing from UCSO internal chat logs. Why on earth would law enforcement be sandbagging two witnesses to their victim in a chat log that's going to be discoverable? Why would they be having that discussion in a recorded chat log? I'll tell you why. Because they weren't really trying to win this case. The theory that I've developed over the past almost 4 years of this is that Mike Smith had a problem with David Levitt, and he wanted to torpedo David Levitt's reelection, and David Levitt took the bait. He held a press conference in which he blew open the Hamblin investigation that was undertaken by Sheriff Mike Smith and the Utah County Sheriff's Office. And Mike Smith had help. He had a former Utah County attorney who David Levitt had fired for taking jazz tickets from a defense attorney. That attorney shows up as the representation or the attorney for fugitive Nicholas Alaverdian, a.k.a. Nicholas Rossi, who would later be extradited to Utah and convicted of rape. At the time, Mr. Rossi was a fugitive from rape charges living in Scotland. And as it so happens, this attorney showed up in Scotland, and while he was discussing Alaverdian, a.k.a. Rossi's case with him, he left his laptop open to the third victim. And the third victim statement, that is Catherine Hamlin's victim statement from the 2012-2014 case, was on the screen. And it just so happens that Nicholas Rossi, a.k.a. Nicholas Alaverdian, who was kind of the John Valjean to David Levitt's Inspector Javert, that is, David Levitt had been trying to extradite him to face charges for rape and sexual assault for years. Alaverdian, a.k.a. Rossi, posts this on his site, blows it into the open. There's a grammar request for those materials and for those victim statements, and the Provo Police Department releases those materials to multiple parties over the course of a number of months. And guess what? Somebody hands a copy of that victim statement to David Levitt. And it's at that point that David Levitt becomes aware that Catherine Hamblin accused him of being a member of the LDS Church of Satan and one of her abusers. And this is significant because like a year or so before, Levitt sat down for an interview with a documentarian named Amy Hurdy. And in that interview, he said that he knew satanic ritual abuse was real, that it did happen. He knew some victims of it. And he knew the victim's father used to poach deer and drink the blood of the deer that he poached, eat the organs of the deer, sacrifice the deer. So before he realized that Catherine Hamblin was pointing the finger at him, he said that satanic ritual abuse was valid. It did happen. It was real. And then at that press conference, we all saw him describe Catherine Hamblin as tragically mentally ill. and say that there was no organized ring of abuse. So there you go. It's real, but when I realize I'm one of the people being accused, it's not just David Lee Hamblin, then it's not real. There's no ring of abuse. On information and belief, the person who provided David Levitt a copy of that victim statement was Adam Herberts. And one of the things that I've come to believe is that Herberts worked with Mike Smith and this former attorney from the Utah County Attorney's Office to ensnare David Levitt and to get him to take the bait so that he would torpedo his own re-election chances. And sure enough, he did. He went, held a press conference, which was an unmitigated disaster for him politically. And now he runs an Instagram account detailing how he's remodeling Knockderry Castle in Scotland with his wife Shalom. To give you an idea of the resources that you're dealing with here, David Levitt in his congressional filings from 2008, when he was running for a U.S. Congress seat, disclosed that his net worth was between $31 and $81 million. That was in 2008. Imagine what it is today. And so what I would say to you is, when we talk about this case and we talk about whether or not there was exculpatory evidence, if you don't understand the full context of this, if you don't understand all of the information that I've outlined in this live stream, and you don't understand all the connections and all the different threads that you could pull at, if you haven't spent 4 years in it, you might fall for it. If all you had to go on was the court records, which is the defense basically running an unopposed disinformation campaign, you might fall for the idea that the prosecution withheld Brady evidence, that they withheld relevant information of those 6 counts. But what I'm telling you is the prosecution never wanted to convict David Lee Hamblin in the first place, because if it did, David Lee Hamblin would likely tell on all of the prominent Utahns who participated in his abuse. And so they got to rake him over the coals 2.5, 3 years. In the Schroeder case, they're still raking him over the coals. He still has pending charges in Manti for what he did to Tobias Schroeder. But he's a free man. And more importantly, David Levitt's a free man. Gordon Bowen's a free man. Any number of other prominent people in the Utah arts community are free people. Like, there hasn't been any culpability for this. And it was credible enough for Homeland Security Investigations, that is Adam Kinnaman and Noel Ingalls, to launch an investigation which they entitled Operation See No Evil. I have documents up on investigationsandritualabuse.com related to that federal investigation in Noel Ingalls' eventual whistleblower complaint. It was credible enough for a federal agency to take it after Provo Police turned it over to Homeland Security Investigations, arguably out of disgust with the fact that it was dismissed in 2014, the original case. And it was dismissed on the grounds that they were having trouble locating, the prosecutors were having trouble locating discoverable evidence to turn over to the prosecution. And then in 2022, before Judge Roger Griffin, one of the assistant attorney generals with the state of Utah, held up a binder like this thick, full of evidence from that case in 2012 to 2014. They always had the evidence. They always had the documentation. They just didn't want to win the case. They didn't want to win the case then, and they didn't want to win the case now. They wanted it to go away. They have achieved their objective. David Levitt's name is mud. He will never have a political future in this state again. And he had to flee the jurisdiction to go buy a castle in Scotland. Like, that's the reality of it. Whether or not he's actually convicted of a crime, his name is mud in perpetuity. And that's what they intended to do. That's what they did with David Lee Hamblin. Between 1999 and 2003, they raked him over the coals in terms of his divorce and his delicensing because he had gone against this group. And he had started to integrate Native American teachings and New Age mumbo-jumbo and the quote-unquote pure doctrine of the LDS Church of Satan. And they got mad and they excommunicated him in 1999, according to his daughters. They were there for the hearing in Provo that the Church of Satan held at night in an LDS meeting house. And they were sexually abused by their grandfather and others. And David Lee Hamblin was excommunicated from the LDS Church of Satan. He was later excommunicated by stake president James Toronto, I believe his name was, from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And he became a pariah. He'd eke by earning a living as a so-called medicine man, conducting healing circles with peyote. Eventually, he breaks off from James Warren Mooney's church and forms his own church, Tatea Topa Native American Church. He is now peddling Mother Earth Manifesta, his latest writing, which he talks about little David and potentially being the victim of childhood abuse himself. Confession is good for the soul, even if you're David Lee Hamblin, unless, of course, it will lead to jail or prison time in an actual criminal case, at which point you're exculpated by an additional allegation of sexual abuse. And when it comes to David Lee Hamblin's attorneys, before I close, I want to mention this. Guess who Michael Petro was employed by as a visiting professor or a visiting attorney in Ukraine? The Levitt Institute for International Development. David Levitt's nonprofit. And here's what's really interesting. David Lee Hamblin had to drop Michael Petro as his attorney because he could afford him in the Manti case involving the allegations that he abused Tobias Schroeder when Schroeder was his therapy patient as a 5-year-old boy. But he managed to somehow afford Michael Petro and Lee Ashton in the Sheets case for over a year after he pleaded poverty in the Manti 6th District Court. Now, he can afford Michael Petro and Lee Ashton's services in the 4th District Court before Roger Griffin. Because guess what? Tobias Schroeder just alleges that Hamblin abused him in therapy. There is no sexual ritual abuse component to be found anywhere in the Schroeder case. Yet. But Hamblin somehow came up with the funds to continue affording to retain Petro and Ashton. Now, Hamblin's mother, Mary June Adams Hamblin, when she died, was worth at least $20 million. That's the value in the tax records of just one parcel of her property in Provo. It's commercial real estate. Jamestown Square, she owns some of those parcels of property that underlie those buildings. She comes from money. She comes from the Booth and Adams family. And as a result, she inherited a great deal of valuable real estate. And her estate is currently the subject of a probate dispute. Last update in the court record was a mediation that was supposed to occur in May 2025. There has been nothing in the record filed to indicate that dispute among her heirs, that is Mary Carol Dangerfield, David Lee Hamblin, Stephen Hamblin, Kristen Cree Hamblin, who is now Mayra Gray, or Suki Christensen. The dispute they had over their mother's estate has been resolved. And there are millions at stake. So at the end of the day, if that estate is divvied up in probate equally among the children, the reality of it is that David Lee Hamblin stands to be a multimillionaire. In addition to being a sexual predator and a con artist. So what I would say to you is, there's not a lot of justice in Utah if you have dirt on other prominent Utahns. And it appears that David Lee Hamblin does have dirt on other prominent Utahns, and it appears that the objective of Mike Smith and others within the Utah County establishment was to get rid of David Levitt, and they were successful at that. I hope that this has been informative to you. If you want to read more about the Hamblin case, you can do so on investigationsandritualabuse.com. And you can also do so on my Substack, Investigations and Ritual Abuse, at https:// 1830goel.substack.com. That is Investigations and Ritual Abuse on Substack. We're running a special whereby you can get access to all three sites that I write at: Government, Sex Predators, Anti-Tribe, and Investigations and Ritual Abuse. If you buy an $8 a month subscription to one of the sites, I'll give you access to the other three, or the other two. If you want to see the source materials that I have posted on investigationsandritualabuse.com, that is the police reports, the victim statements, affidavits, and other materials from Gordon Bowen's divorce, you can absolutely peruse those documents for free. If you'd support us with an annual subscription of $50, that'd be great. The only reason it's behind a paywall at Investigations and Ritual Abuse is because people in Hamblin's orbit kept filing copyright complaints against us with Substack. It was out from behind a paywall. And then I had to put it behind a paywall to limit the amount of copyright complaints and other matters. I kept beating them on appeal, but of course I was spending all of my time dealing with that instead of doing investigative journalism. This is Goel of investigationsandritualabuse.com. I hope that this has addressed some of the issues raised by Justin Riggs of LDS abuse. I believe I misidentified him earlier as Justin Griffin. That's a different Justin. Also a quality guy. You should check out his film, Who Killed Joseph Smith? Interesting film, whether you agree with its conclusions or not. He was excommunicated. I withdrew my membership before they could excommunicate me. So what I would tell you is, as I said, till I'm blue in the face over the past almost 4 years, all sexual abuse is satanic. It is abominable that in the state of Utah they have a 2.97% conviction rate. You have to try to have a conviction rate that low on rape. It's abominable that they only prosecute under 12% of rape reports that are brought. There's your sign. And for any sexual abuse victims, any ritual abuse victims who are watching this, what I would say to you is, I'm committed to fighting this and trying to change this, not just in Utah, but elsewhere, for the rest of my life. I have made my position very clear on sexual abuse. And that is that if you are a perpetrator of sexual abuse, you should face capital punishment for any type of sexual abuse against any victim. Rapists don't rehabilitate. Pedophiles don't rehabilitate. And the only good rapists and the only good are dead rapists and pedophiles. That's the only way we can be assured that these people won't sexually victimize others. I think it's the only moral position to have, quite frankly, is capital punishment for people who commit sexual abuse and sexual assault. I don't think in the state of Utah we should be spending $70,000 to incarcerate these people, $70,000 in taxpayer funds. And that's what it costs in the state of Utah annually to incarcerate a prisoner. It's $70,000. In other states, it's around between $30,000 and $40,000. The state of Utah, everything from the property taxes to the income taxes is more expensive. Whether or not that $70,000 actually goes to incarceration or it's some form of fraud and padding the bill, separate matter for another podcast or live stream. But ultimately, I think we need to be spending $70,000 per victim annually, not $70,000 per perpetrator. I think there's a much stronger argument to be made for our taxpayer resources going to provide necessary services for people who have been victimized by men like David Lee Hamblin, rather than incarcerating men like David Lee Hamblin. I think that we need to have a change of attitudes towards the problem of pedophilia and the problem of sexual predators. These are scourges, not just in Utah, but nationally. And the future I envision, one where my daughter can walk around safely as a woman, and where my nephews don't have to rely on the fact that, their uncle is a deterrent to this type of behavior, is a future in which sexual predators are put to death in short order once they are convicted. And that's the only way we can be certain that they won't reoffend. This is Goel of Investigations Ritual Abuse, Anti-Tribe, and Government Sex Predators signing off. Thank you all for watching, and if you would, like and subscribe and share this content with whoever. I'll come back later and we'll have another live stream probably later this week for both Anti-Tribe and Government Sex Predators, and we'll try to have some more content out based on the work that I've been doing recently on IRA. I've been sick since August. That seems to have been mitigated somewhat by treatment, but ultimately, any prayers you can offer would be great as it pertains to my health, because I have not done well since August. I will talk to you later. I'll take your prayers, I'll take your subscriptions, I'll take your shares, your likes, and anything else you can offer in the way of support. Victims or people with information can contact me at goel at investigationsandritualabuse.com. That is GOEL at investigationsandritualabuse.com. I'll talk to you later. God bless you. And thanks